I'm Linda Tobash, Senior Advisor for Education here at the Society, and our event today is special, and that's because it is a collaboration between the Policy Department and the Education Department. And I want to do a shout out to Jonathan Corrado, our Director of Policy, who couldn't be with us today, and also Christy Alexander, who's in the back there taking pictures, a program officer in policy. We worked closely on this event, and I have to say it was a lot of fun working with everyone. So thank you. Before I introduce our speakers, I have two housekeeping items. One is we will have time for questions at the end, and for those of you here in New York in the audience, we have microphones for you. And for those of you virtually, you should feel free at any time during the presentation to submit your questions by sending them to policy@koreasociety, one word, .org. That's policy.koreasociety.org. We can't guarantee that we'll get to all your questions, but we will do our very best. And also following the presentation, for those in New York, unfortunately not virtually, but for those in New York, there'll be light refreshments in our kitchen, which are to your left. And now I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Aram Hur, and our discussant, Dr. Darcie Draught. Dr. Hur is currently the Kim Koo Chair in Korean Studies and Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Prior to this position, she taught at the University of Missouri and served as co-director of its Institute for Korean Studies. Her research focuses on, of course, nationalism and democracy, our topic today, but with a specialization in issues of identity change, integration, and democratic support in East Asia. Dr. Hur holds a PhD from Princeton, an MPP from Harvard's Kennedy School, and a BA with honors from Stanford. Her book, Narratives of Civic Duty, received the 2023 Robert A. Dahl Award from the American Political Science Association for scholarship of the highest quality on the subject of democracy by an untenured scholar. I have to say that this is not just a tremendous award for Dr. Hur, it's a tremendous award for the field. The award is named after Robert A. Dahl, a pioneering scholar on democracy. It is the first book on East Asian democracies to be selected for the Dahl list, and only the second book on Korean politics in nearly half a century to ever win a disciplinary level book award from the American Political Science Association. So congratulations and thank you for this tremendous contribution to the field. I'm also pleased to let you know that we're very proud to say that she was a recipient of our 2021 Sherman Family Korea Emerging Scholar Lecture Award. So again, thanks for returning to speak with us. Our discussant, Dr. Darcie Draught, is a postdoctoral research associate at the Princeton School of Public Affairs. She also currently holds a number of non-resident fellowships, and I'm going to read my notes because there's quite a list here. George Washington University's Institute for Korean Studies, the Korean Economic Institute, the National Bureau of Asian Research, and the European Center for North Korean Studies at the University of Vienna. So she straddles two worlds,
Yeah.
several worlds actually. She's been named a member of the National Committee on North Korea and one of the next generation Korea Peninsula specialists at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. She holds a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins, an MA in Korean Studies from Yonsei University's Graduate School in International Studies, and a BA with honors in anthropology from Davidson College. A political scientist and a policy analyst, she publishes regular commentary on South and North Korean domestic politics and foreign policy, Northeast Asian relations, and U.S.-Korea policy. And now it's my honor to turn the program over to Dr. Hur. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for this gracious invitation and for everybody in New York and online on live stream for being here today. So the title of my book is Narratives of Civic Duty, How National Stories Shape Democracy in Asia. And so since we're going to be talking a lot about narratives, I want to start on sort of a personal note and a personal story of how this all started. And so many of us probably have a kind of first significant political memory growing up, and this was mine. This is 97, the Asian financial crisis, and the national gold drive that was launched in response to that. And what you see here is a photo of, South Koreans lined up. And this was January, February, freezing cold in South Korea, holding things like wedding rings, family heirlooms, trophies, jewelry, to essentially donate these items for the sake of, at the time, a very young and still quite unstable democracy. And so I was watching this as a young person and thinking, what on earth actually motivated these people to sacrifice like that, right? To really uphold what they saw to be a moral obligation to their state, even when it was very personally costly to do so. And this is what we more colloquially refer to as, a sense of civic duty. And civic duty is something that has always been sort of a nice to have in democracies, sometimes maybe even taken for granted. But I really think its critical importance has been revealed more recently with the recent wave of democratic backsliding. So when democratic institutions and formal checks and balances fail, right, often the last bastion against democratic backsliding falls on the shoulder of ordinary citizens, right? Citizens who are willing to act as Democrats with a small d first, and then partisans or classists or members of their ethnic groups second. And so why do some people feel the sense of civic duty? What makes them willing to sacrifice for my democracy? These are the main questions that I tackle in the book. And it certainly took me much longer than what I'm going to say now to realize this, but actually the answer lied in how I just posed the question, right? My democracy. So democracies, and more specifically democratic states, are not these identity-neutral entities. They are often very closely associated with a particular national identity or a nationalist vision. And so for many people, the nation is a special kind of community. It's one of those communities that are experienced as if natural and become this integral part of how we think about ourselves as persons. And instead of kind of giving you abstract theories on this, I want to actually read you an excerpt from the book that really brings to life sort of why nations hold this special power over many of us. So this is on page 18. The nation has many ways of seeping into the personal realm of home. The national language is not just what is used in public schools and official documents. It is often one's mother tongue, how a person first learns to call her mother and father. The national culture is not just an abstract list of foods or traditions. It is the comfort foods that one grew up eating in the kitchen and the childhood songs one knows by heart and will one day sing to one's own children. The national history is not just what's commemorated on official holidays or written in textbooks. It is the parables of heroes and villains that grandparents would tell at family gatherings to their wide-eyed grandchildren. And so such rituals are not explicitly nationalistic, but over time they build an almost instinctual boundary and attachment around the national we. Right? And so it's for those very reasons that for many of us, the nation is able to instill this kind of intrinsic sense of moral obligation to care and contribute to its welfare, even when it's costly to do so. And the core argument of the book is that for many individuals, a sense of civic duty comes down to what is actually quite a simple question. Do I see the democratic state in which I live to represent the best interests of my nation and my national people? Now, I didn't time this talk this way, but we're sitting in this room as world events are unfolding, and many of us are much more familiar with the dark and dangerous examples of national duty, how it can lead to things like chauvinism, xenophobia, and even full-blown genocides. And we're at I think, a very particularly fragile moment in talking about nationalism, as it's seen as sort of this primary driving force of democratic backsliding, as well as growing security conflicts in Asia, but also worldwide. So the real question here is, how does duty to the nation, which on the one hand can do these terrible things, how can that be politicized into a distinctly civic and constructive sense of duty to democracy? And the answer that the book focuses on is the role of what I call national stories. So national stories are kind of the folklore of the national people. So they exist below the level of constitutive, frozen in time type of myths, but above the level of personal anecdotes. And these stories chronicle a nation's history, but also add a very important element of parable based on lived experience of national victories, failures, and importantly, who stood with us versus betrayed us in our times of need. And so essentially in this way, they are fundamentally relationship stories that define, as a member of this nation, what do I owe to whom and to which group? And in that sense, these stories come to define a nation's boundaries of moral obligation. And we don't often think about this, but the state is actually a key protagonist in national stories. So the state's actions, policy decisions, choices in terms of who gets what, and their rhetoric of the leadership, these provide the raw material, the raw content on which national stories are based, and come to shape what I call popularized or historicized beliefs of nation-state linkage. That's essentially sort of the moral relationship that ties a national people to a particular state. And depending on whether the state is portrayed in these stories as a champion and a protector of the national people, or whether it's portrayed as an oppressor and a betrayer of the national people, that comes to determine and shape whether a national people see that state as an object of national duty or an object of national doubt. Now, as you can see here, there's nothing in this argument that's specific to East Asia, but the book does focus on South Korea and Taiwan, which I think is very meaningful because these are two democracies that come from a region that has long been seen as democratically hindered by its collectivist culture, Confucian culture, that is not very fit with liberal values, as well as its sort of strong currents of ethnic nationalism, which is generally seen as something that is bad for democracy. And what I hope that through this comparison the book convinces you of is that civic duty is something that's neither determined by the culture or even the character of a national people, but rather something that is, really intimately shaped by sort of the constructed and relational politics between a national people and the state that they call home. So I want to give you a flavor for a quick sort of history of how these different national stories came to be. So Korea's national stories have historically painted a very strong and symbiotic relationship between the nation and the state, providing what I call in the book a thick identity basis for civic duty. So for the Koreans in the room, sort of thinking about Korea as this ethnic nation might feel like second nature, but it actually traces back to a very particular moment in Korean modern history of the racialization of Korean identity as essentially a survival response to Japanese colonialism. So the nationalist elites at the time thought, okay, by locating Korean identity in the bloodline, right, in this shared singular bloodline, the nation would be able to remain intact and continuous even if our political autonomy was lost, right? So it's a very strategic decision. And what happens after independence in South Korea is that the Park Chung-hee authoritarian regime continues to seed these types of national stories that paint the people and the state as if one body, by explicitly drawing on this one bloodline metaphor in government programs like the New Village Movement, the Semaurundong, the National Charter of Education, mass public health vaccination campaigns, as well as military service. So these stories continue to percolate during the authoritarian era. Now, I want to be careful here and not sugarcoat in any way Korea's history, right? At the same time, there was also very targeted state repression of progressive segments in society. But what's interesting from a narrative perspective is that when we get to the pro-democracy movement, the activists don't end up framing their demands for democracy as a rejection of existing national stories, but actually as a restoration, right? That democratization is really the only way for the state to fully represent the best interests of all Korean people. And so the idea of preserving the bloodline, the 민족, is one of the three mins that constitute the Minjung movement. And so post-democratization, South Korea's national stories continue to kind of uphold this ideal of mutual obligation between the people and the state. And it's just 10 years after that, in 97, that you see that outpouring of civic duty during the Asian financial crisis and the national gold drive. Now, I know this is the Korea Society, but we need to talk about Taiwan in comparison to this to really show you how this works, right? So what I want to actually start with Taiwan is how similar it is to South Korea. These are two democracies that have nearly identical timelines and pathways towards democratization, very same patterns of rapid economic development through the 1980s, and both are generally racially homogenous societies. The key difference here is that Taiwan's national stories tend to instill a weak and oppositional linkage vis-a-vis the state, providing what I in the book describe as sort of only a thin identity foundation for civic duty. So, when you measure civic duty in surveys of, do you feel like it's your duty to vote or duty to serve, you might get similar levels, but what's underlying, the motivation that's underlying that sense of civic duty is much more vulnerable to changes in payoffs and costs. And so how did Taiwan get here? It starts around the same time as Korea with independence from Japan. The Kuomintang, or the KMT, loses the Chinese Civil War and temporarily retreats to the island, right? At the time, with the full intent of taking back the mainland. So to do that, they launch a very aggressive re-Sinicization campaign on the islanders, banning local culture, dialects, history that had evolved over generations of separation from the mainland. But such efforts are extremely brutal at times, and this is an embossing of the infamous 228 incident where many islander dissidents and leaders were massacred. And these KMT efforts ultimately backfire. So instead of eliminating islander identity, what they do is actually they give birth to a uniquely Taiwanese sense of nationalism, born in backlash to state oppression and in the exact counter image of the KMT's nationalist vision, which was Taiwan as part of this greater Chinese nation. So what you have now for the majority of citizens in Taiwan today who identify as pro-Taiwan, these are individuals who grew up on national stories that frame what they still see to be a pretty heavy KMT legacy state, even post-democratization, whose official name, by the way, is still Republic of China, as an object of national doubt rather than national duty. And there are all sorts of implications of this for what's going on in the cross-strait right now that I'd be happy to expand upon in the Q&A. So, for those skeptics in the room and on live, we're thinking, okay, well, this is a bunch of stories and it's very fluffy and, it's hard to nail down. I want to emphasize that the book really carefully traces how these different nation-building strategies post-independence produced different flavors of national stories, and then connecting that to contemporary, different contrasting identity foundations for civic duty in the post-democratization period. This tracing occurs through a variety of empirical evidence. I want to, give you a snapshot of what that includes, ranging from personal narrative interviews to survey modeling, statistical modeling of survey data, where use formal modeling to this is for the academics and social scientists in the audience. Use formal modeling to really be able to tease out and identify moral motivations from non-moral incentives, as well as a pair of experiments on both turnout and in a sort of natural crisis, to show you that civic duty is not just lip service, that it does lead to higher rates of citizen voluntary compliance in these sort of costly situations. But for this talk, I want to give you a sneak peek into the personal narratives. Because if you've been following so far, I know many of you in your heads are thinking at this point, okay, so what do these actually look like? What do national stories actually look like on the ground? And how do they work exactly? You've told this nice historical story, but how do they actually work? So in this portion of the book, I analyzed over 200 written and oral personal narratives in South Korea and Taiwan about civic duty towards specifically military service. Now, as you know, both democracies have compulsory conscription. So I focus here on, why do many overseas Koreans in South Korea still feel a civic duty to return and fulfill military service, even when they have sort of a legalized pathway out of that obligation? And at the same time, why so many Taiwanese youth are reluctant and feel very little sense of duty to serve in the all-volunteer force. So AVF is sort of a parallel program that the Taiwan government has tried to grow in parallel with conscription to move towards sort of a more professionalized kind of US style of a military model. It's been met with really, really serious recruitment issues, right? So the answer that I find is really that, what it means to be a real Korean or a good Taiwanese person, member of the Taiwanese nation, is associated with completely different citizen scripts of behavior, right? So in South Korea, we see that being a real Korean is very closely associated with kind of state-supportive citizenship roles and behaviors. Whereas in Taiwan, for citizens who identify as Taiwanese, right, it is associated with actually what I would describe as counter-state citizen behaviors of always being wary and watchful of the state. So what do these actually look like? So this is the annual essay publication from the Military Manpower Administration in South Korea, from which I drew a lot of these written personal narratives in the South Korean case. And what I see here is that national stories typically come in the form of anecdotal stories that fathers tend to tell their sons about what their experience in the military was like, how it changed them for the better. And these look like kind of really personal stories, but in the aggregate, when you flip through like 160 of these types of essays, what begins to emerge from these national stories is almost what I would call a national idiom of, I'm sure some of the men in this room are familiar with this, you're not a real Korean man, right? Until you have served in the military. And what this does is it instills in these overseas Koreans who have spent most of their lives not even in South Korea with this idea that, sacrificing for the state, fulfilling my duty to the state is what makes me Korean, right? And you see that in these excerpts that I've pulled, and you'll see here explicit appeals to that bloodline metaphor that I just talked about. This is not something that should be or that I want to be praised for doing. I am simply serving right now because it is my duty, as it was for my father and grandfather before that. So you see this generational bloodline metaphor coming through. Second person says, I'm embarrassed when people call me a patriot for deciding to serve. As someone who was born in Korea, speaks Korean, and has Korean blood coursing through his veins, serving in the military is a given, right? So what these national stories do is that they end up framing civic duty to military service as a natural given duty of what it means to be Korean, that those two things are very closely tied together. So what does that look like in Taiwan? Right. So this is sort of like a data map, and it's okay if you can't see the text. I will walk you through what it says of the over 40 personal narrative interviews that I did in person. And what you see here is that, again, Taiwanese national stories, these are not mandated by the state. These are learned within the home through stories that grandparents tell to their grandchildren about. Let me tell you the ghost stories of what it was like to live under Chiang Kai-shek during the KMT military rule. Little sort of stories that parents will tell when they see people from the PRC that, we don't act that way, drawing that sort of instinctual boundary between what it means to be Taiwanese versus Chinese. And so these subjects grow up under these stories. They are kind of solidified as they have real lived interactions with the state. So a lot of these people who grew up in Taiwanese identifying families go to high school and they come back saying, wait, I didn't think Chiang Kai-shek was a hero, but that's not what I'm learning at school, right? This dissonance already between sort of the state mandated vision of national identity versus what they learned at home. And so they solidify, these national stories become solidified through these interactions. And then the military in Taiwan, the Kuomintang regime was a military regime, right? So as an extension, sort of a direct extension of the KMT legacy state, they start to see the military as biased towards a particular kind of pro-China identity. And, they'll literally say things like, well, most people with high status or high careers in Taiwan are what we call Waishengren, literally out of province people, right? The KMT that came over to the island after the loss of the Civil War. I think they'll go back to China sooner or later. Now, it's not really relevant whether these statements are factually correct. This is what people perceive, right? So then when you ask them, so what about, signing up to be a professional soldier in the all-volunteer force? Their answer to that is, well, fighting for the KMT, right, that's just contrary to my identity. It violates everything that I've learned about who I am and where I belong, right? And I want to be clear here, it's not that Taiwanese youth don't feel duty to their nation. In fact, they feel tremendous duty to their nation. And if you ask them in surveys right now, right, as cross-strait is heating up, the percentage of folks who say, I will fight is really above and beyond what we should expect, given the realities of that situation. But when it comes to serving in the military of the state, right, that duty does not translate into sort of this widespread kind of civic duty to the state in which they live. So For those of you who have not read the book, who might be interested in reading the book, this is sort of what we are leaving out today. So in South Korea, again, after that narrative analysis, I take you on a journey through some national priming experiments, if you're quantitatively inclined, on how strongly kind of priming national attachment can increase a sense of civic duty in places like South Korea, but fail to do so in places like Taiwan. I also look at representative survey data because we talked about military service, but there are all sorts of other forms of civic duties that are important to democracies. So I cover this through civic duty to vote, pay taxes, as well as the civic duty to fight in the case of war. And then we go halfway across the world to Germany, to a completely different cultural, political, historical context. And what's really intriguing about Germany, and I chose to focus on Germany because it's so often used as, or brought up as sort of a model example for Korea, is that if you look under the surface, there is a really puzzling, enduring civic duty gap that still exists, that has not narrowed over generational turnover between the former East and West. And these things manifest in things like lower turnout rates in the East, but also in things like, more deep-rooted support for parties like the AfD in the East, higher rates of per capita violence against migrants in the East. So what you see here is sort of this unrepaired linkage of former Easterners to what they see as a very abrupt and one-sided process of reunification. So this sort of national lens on where civic duty comes from helps to explain in a different way. It's not just economic dissatisfaction. It's not just feelings of alienation. Why these things persist in modern Germany today. And then finally, the book ends with sort of a very broad bird's eye view cross-national test of over 27,000 democratic citizens across the world, and how for many of them, civic duty does have national roots. So quick takeaways. The main thing here is that a sense of civic duty and in relation, sort of resilient democracies has less to do with having the right kind of culture or character, and much more to do with the national identity politics within a given state. That means that civic duty is something that can be easily lost and fractured and weakened, but also that it's something that can be conscientiously grown and fostered, right? And the state and the political elites have a great deal of agency in that process to either strengthen or weaken their democracy's civic capacity. So this is a very different argument from a lot of prior work that has said, democracy is hard to grow in Asia because it has, cultural values and certain identity legacies that are contrary to democracy. And this book should really be sort of a statement against those types of misperceptions and overly deterministic theories of Asia's democratic potential going forward. The final thing is that there is no such thing as good or bad nationalisms. People tend to think that ethnic nationalism tends to be much more violent, exclusive, bad, and civic nationalisms, mostly of the West, tend to be more liberal, pro-democratic by nature, etc. And I just showed you evidence from two democracies with similarly ethnic nationalisms that have very different implications for their civic duty and democratic potential. So there's no good or bad nationalisms, there's only good or bad national relationships. And those relationships is where politics matters. It's where leadership matters, right? So why, obviously I think these things are important, but why this book right now? Right? Why should you feel like you should go and get this book or read this book right now? And, I really see East Asia as being on a democratic juncture. So, typically threats to democracy, especially in the Asia region, used to be much more external. Nuclear threats, economic coercions, things that were coming from the outside. Increasingly, the threats to democracy that we're seeing, not only in East Asia, but really worldwide, are actually rising from within and tend to be identity-based. So take South Korea, for example, right? Most of us in this room know that South Korea has had the lowest birth rate among OECD countries since about 2015, for the past 7 years, and it's gone straight down, right? And so it's facing sort of what many see as this inevitable era of migration, which South Korea really hasn't done in its history before. But clearly, its sort of bloodline-based ethnic nationalism of the past is really ill-equipped to deal with these types of growing pains, right? Take Taiwan, right? As cross-state relations heat up and you see a much more aggressive and even potentially kinetic China, it's really forcing the Taiwanese to think not just about what does our nation stand against, but what does our nation stand for? And those types of questions are the questions that need to be first answered before we talk about military strategies and technological capabilities, because somebody still has to be willing to stand up to man those things, right? So because of these issues, these underlying sort of nationalist landscape is super important. And these are definitely periods of upheaval and instability, no doubt. I don't want to refute that, but to close on a little bit of an optimistic note, there are also, from my perspective, opportunities to rewrite and reimagine national stories in a way that can lay actually stronger civic foundations towards democratic resilience rather than democratic regress. Thank you so much. Thanks. Great. I went a little bit over time.
No, but it's all wonderful. Yeah. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Darcie.
I've had the chance to read this book a while ago, and I had the chance to interview Aram for a Korea Economic Institute podcast. And when I met her, it's going to seem like a lot of flattery, but I brought the book because I felt like a total graduate student because I had marked it all up. I enjoyed it so much that I hope it made
it was a very touching.
Yeah. And just now I had thought of some questions before, but I was scribbling a bunch more that came up. It's just it not only is a superb piece of scholarship, as was mentioned, it's won this very prestigious award in political science, but it's also just a joy to read. It's a excellent piece of prose, which I think is something that's not always commented on, but as readers of lots of things about Korea, it's always appreciated to read something that's just so evocative. There's a lot of things I could ask you, and we are going to open to questions in a minute, but as discussant, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask you a couple questions first. The one thing that I think is particularly interesting and salient these days, as you mentioned, is how does nationalism relate to the contemporary climate of potential democratic backsliding and where are liberal values? And particularly, the question that I love that you put out is, what do we owe each other? Because that's a big part of how nationalism is. It's to whom we owe things to. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, right? You sketched the history and the contemporary kind of maybe frictions that are going, particularly in terms of if national identity, these national stories are about relationships. You have the relationships to your community and then relationship to the state. Right. So I was wondering if you could kind of unpack that a little, particularly given the case that, as you brought up, the traditional ethnic versus civic, they've converged in many ways in the latter part of the 20th century in the cases that you've described. So can you disentangle those convergences and the frictions that you're seeing that potentially might come out?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why you hear nationalism most these days is in the context of polarization. And as well as sort of nationalist/populist movements that you're seeing as the main driver of democratic instability, really across the world, not just in East Asia. And the thing that I want to point out there is that a lot of those articles or discussions are not very sharp on the relationship between nationalism and things like polarization and populism. Nationalism is a political resource just like anything else, and it depends on who chooses to use it and how. And so when you see polarization, for example, and when it gets, when it actually gets very dangerous for democracy, people tend to think of polarization as a matter of intensity, right? So if you get more extreme polarization, that's bad for democracy. The problem with that argument is, well, you need some polarization for healthy democracies. Polarization essentially means that you have different options and different sets of choices. So where is that line at which it becomes bad? My sort of take on that and where nationalism fits into that is we should kind of maybe steer away from thinking about intensity of polarization and think a little bit more about the axis of polarization. So the core principle of any nationalist movement is really this very strong desire by the national people to see themselves as a people worthy of their own autonomous government and state, and their desire to achieve that, right? So when parties within a democracy become polarized based on differing nationalist visions of how to achieve that, that's when you get real violations of liberal processes and principles, because the goal of democratic competition is no longer, better policy representation. The goal of democratic competition becomes ownership of the state, exclusive ownership of the state under my party's nationalist vision. That's when you start getting rhetoric, both in South Korea, but also the US. We don't need to look so far for these examples of statements like, not my president, right? Or that, the other party is a threat to the nation. This kind of rhetoric, that's where we see polarization becoming really a threat to democracy's liberal values. And so that has less to do with the intensity of polarization. We've seen this level of intensity before. What feels different and is different right now is that partisan polarization is increasingly now going on national identity terms of pitting different visions of where the nation should go and what the nation means against each other within a democracy. And I think, the book shows what happens in those instances. You get erosion of the identity basis of civic duty. So you have, for those citizens who feel like when the other party is in power, that not only is this a rival party, but it's a rival nation, a group of people that see what it means to be Korean or American in a fundamentally different way from myself. Those are the people that are in power. What does that do? Their sense of duty to my nation promotes them to do exactly sort of that oppositional counter-state citizen behavior of, we need to reclaim the state from these people who have betrayed our nation. And that's exactly the rhetoric, right, that you see in the news media these days in a variety of democracies. And so, what role should nationalism play? And, various world leaders in response to democratic backsliding have said, we need to tamp down on nationalism. We need to curb it. We need to really, turn down the temperature. And, my response to that and the book's response to that is, well, nationalism can do scary things, but also it's a fundamental part of what makes a lot of democracies work at the ground level. So to say that the solution there is to do away with nationalism, I think is perhaps too short term. I think what we need actually is more nationalism or more national stories of a certain kind that can bridge these gaps between parties, between warring factions that have really bifurcated a lot, due to real social pressures, but bifurcated in a way where we've now pitted an existing singular national community into different nationalist factions, and that's when polarization, in my mind, gets pernicious.
Yeah, we're living in such a period of change that in political science, also I think in popular parlance, we talk about civic nationalism. You mentioned this, but I kind of want to delve into it a little bit more because there's this common, bifurcation of civic nationalism is good and ethnic nationalism is bad.
Yep.
And this is always, as a political scientist, this has always not really sat well with me because we see in cases like South Korea a very strong sense of ethnic community, cultural markers of feelings of belonging, but also the more civic things like we speak the same language, we all have liberal values, we've participated in this vibrant democratization movement that continues to today, right? Thinking also in terms of South Korea has successfully impeached a president that was counter to what the nation saw in their interests, right? So we have these liberal or civic values with ethnic. That being the case, how is this approaching change going forward, particularly as you brought up the question of demographic change that's happening in the country? So I'm writing a book right now about demographic change, immigration, and citizenship. So this is partly based on my own interest and but I think that these are things that are unprecedented, certainly for South Korea.
Right.
Taiwan has had different experiences with them too. So I think in that sense, maybe we could do some comparison there. But what do you see down the road that friction or how can the national stories revise themselves given this era of ethnic diversification and identity diversification that's happening in South Korea today?
So, for the non-political scientists in the room, there's been this enduring idea that, ethnic nationalism is bad and backwards and undemocratic. And that civic nationalism, which is a nationalism based on sort of shared set of political values, is inherently more inclusive, pro-democratic, more peaceful, right? But if you think about what civic nationalism is, it's just another way of drawing boundaries, right? Every kind of nationalism is a way of drawing boundaries around who belongs in this political community and who doesn't, right? And we've seen civic nationalism, especially in the context of migration, be an extreme barrier. You have to speak the language, you have to know the political history, and if you don't subscribe to these values, right, then you cannot be part of our nation, and there are barriers to that kind of national citizenship, right? So I think we need to really move away from this idea that if only ethnic nationalisms could embrace more civic values, that they would somehow get better and that their democracies would somehow be stronger. That, I think, is a false dichotomy, and whether an ethnic nationalisms, as Darcie said, right, have civic elements and vice versa. How it relates to change and really South Korea's impending demographic crisis. So as I briefly mentioned, the fertility rate in South Korea is really dire, and I think this bears sort of emphasis. Most people tend to think of this as an economic problem, the obvious things, right? Labor shortage, economic stagnation, and those things are all very real. But they are also such deeply socially destabilizing issues. If you look at South Korea's population pyramid, and we call it a pyramid because in a healthy society, you're supposed to have a bigger, younger population supporting, a smaller, older generation. It's essentially like a diamond right now. And if you run simulations in sort of 2 generational cycles, it'll approach a completely inverted triangle. Meaning an ever-shrinking younger generation is now responsible of taking care of an ever outsized elderly generation. In addition to the fertility rate, another stat that people don't really talk about is that the elderly poverty rate in South Korea is about 40%, and the elderly suicide rate is about 3 times as high as the OECD average. Right? So these are phenomena that extend beyond just economy, but really fundamentally start to erode sort of basic social fabrics, erode stories of, who's responsible for what and what do we owe each other as national members. And because they fundamentally start to hit at the identity foundation of civic attachment to the democracy, this is also, the demographic crisis, and I've said this elsewhere before, is just as much a democracy crisis. the primary challenge, as I see it, is that, South Korea, the government's strategies to boost marriage rates and fertility rates have largely been unsuccessful. And there are, enduring deep-seated cultural reasons for that. So the sort of primary way that the government has dealt with this is actually through the import of marriage migrants, as Darcie knows very well through her work. That, poses a lot of national integration challenges in a place like South Korea that has historically never dealt with this level of migration before, and whose traditional national stories are fundamentally ill-equipped to deal. And, I want to parse this out because, the sort of popular answer to it was, well, become a multicultural nation, right? It's globalism, and the South Korean government itself, both progressive and conservative governments, have really emphasized South Korea's need to become a multicultural nation. So I know that this is about this book, but I'm working already on the second book, which is tentatively titled "The Stories We Tell," and nation building in the era of migration, because when you actually go into the field and test whether this multicultural narrative works, it dramatically backfires among Native South Koreans in terms of their inclusivity and support for migration, because it fundamentally goes against everything that they kind of grew up on. And so, the sort of challenge with the second book, which really comes directly out of this first one, and the questions that it raises right at the end, is how can we use alternative national narratives that are not simply going multicultural or going civic, to really target, changing what is formally a very exclusive nation to a much more inclusive nation. So, whenever that book comes out, I hope to see many of you there again. But to kind of preview the findings, and we did not expect this going in. The one narrative that actually seems to be most effective is actually emphasizing the democratic aspect of South Korea's national identity. And that happens to be the one aspect of Korean national identity that the government has not really leaned into. They've tried the economic story, they've tried the multicultural story, essentially sort of an alternative constitutive story. Those things actually tend to not only not be effective, but actually backfire among certain segments of natives. And so the one story that we've consistently found to actually be the most effective is this democracy narrative. So we're in the process right now of sifting through those data and really trying to figure out, why that one seems to be the most appealing.
That's interesting. I mean, I think we can then kind of pivot back to your current, the current book's topic is, if we kind of drill down a little bit more on the multicultural, the demographic future aspect in terms of military service and that part of the story. Because until, I can't remember the exact year, until 2010s, Korean citizen men who had a foreign parent couldn't serve in the military. Right? So there was a legal prescription from them participating in what was the national duty, right? So that's the one thing that's going on. And then two, we're seeing, especially among younger generations, a new type of gender politics. So in the backdrop of demographic change, fewer troops in South Korea, the need for, right? So now there's a big debate going on, should women serve in the military, in what capacity? And it's very interesting because you see both women and men have some surprising opinions about it because of various reasons about what is duty, to whom, to whom do they owe that sort of duty. So how would you kind of parse these things going forward?
I think South Korea, from the perspective of the book, is really at a critical juncture. I talked a lot about national stories in South Korea having this very strong linkage between the people and the state. The upcoming generation has had very different experiences from the ones that I have had watching things like the Asian financial crisis and the gold drive. So this is so far out for them. This is before their time. What they've grown up under is things like memories of Sewol, right? where a great many number of high school students essentially drowned to death because the state did not come to aid fast enough. Memories of Itaewon, the recent crowd crush. And bear in mind, it's the same generation. Those folks who are high schoolers for Sewol are now the college students who just lived through Itaewon as well. And it just so happens that the incumbent administrations in both were conservative, but this is not about conservative or progressive. It's about the role of the state, right? So we have a younger generation of South Koreans, and now, right now, those younger generation people are now graduating from college, trying to find jobs, trying to get married, right? And finding that the housing market makes it basically financially impossible, given the norms around who provides the housing and everything in marriage in South Korea, makes it nearly impossible for a great number of South Korean men to actually bring an attractive package for marriage. And it's all that same generation. So what you're seeing is in the upcoming generation, sort of this erosion, if you will, right, of national stories that paint the state as one that takes care of and protects the interests of my nation, right? They see the older generation as perhaps part of Korea's past national identity, but they are the national future for South Korea. And their national stories are taking on a very different kind of flavor. And in a way that, based on the findings from the book, should cause a lot of worry. Because as I said, as that population pyramid inverts itself, this is precisely the generation that will have bigger welfare burdens, that will have to bear the brunt of the integration and growing pain challenges of migration. And at the same time, you have this erosion of that identity linkage that I talked about. Those beliefs are very much tenuous right now in this young generation. And so that I see as as much of a sort of source of instability for South Korea's democratic future, just as much as threats from North Korea or, sort of a growingly aggressive China pose. These internal threats, they're harder to see because they're sort of under the surface. But, I think these are the real challenges that South Korea's democracy faces as the flavor of national stories begin to change by generation. Yeah.
Want to go ahead and open up?
Right. Yeah, we want to make sure that we have time for your questions. So if anyone has a question, you can put up your hand, and we'll bring a microphone. If you can just introduce yourself, your name and your affiliation, if appropriate. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aram. Professor.
It's working.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm an assistant professor from the National University of Singapore, here as a visiting faculty. So I have two questions for you. A wonderful presentation. It's very inspiring. The first question that I have is with regards to the origins of the nationalist stories. In your presentation, it seemed a little equivocal about whether these nationalist stories were top-down driven or they were bottom-up driven. So I wonder if you have a position on that. And number two is, to the extent that nationalist stories are state and politically elite-driven, to what degree is there a line between nationalist stories and state propaganda? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is going to sound like kind of a cop-out answer, but I really do think that national stories become gelled in that interactive space between top-down and bottom-up. Because if you see, Taiwan's case, the state really tried hard to instill a certain kind of national story, but in fact, a lot of Taiwanese national stories were instilled within the home and explicitly sort of in backlash to those state efforts or despite those kinds of state efforts. So, the state matters in the sense that, its policy decisions, leadership rhetoric, redistributive positions, entry decisions, naturalization, like all of these things provide the raw like fodder for national stories. But because these are stories, right? These are narratives that people tell each other, that parents tell to their children, it filters through a personal lens or a group-based lens of what actually the lived experience under those policies has been like, right? So, I said that civic duty comes down to the question of, do I see the state to represent the best interests, right? Because sometimes it will fail, right? Oftentimes states do. But what is really the intent behind that state action? Is it really to protect people like me? And so it's different from sort of a tit for tat policy evaluation of, is the state serving me well now? It's something that's deeper than that, about what do my generationally passed down lived experience, right, under this state or regime, tell me about the intent of the state towards my national people. So it does really exist in that contested space between top down and bottom up. So, in terms of the role of state propaganda, it can be very powerful, I think, especially in the short run. But, as Vyoki said, another very famous political scientist said, voters are not fools. Lived experience and sort of that learned parable-like know-how of having to live and survive and thrive under a particular state teaches you a great deal, I think, about whether that state propaganda actually reflects genuine state intent or if it is what it is, propaganda, right? So I think in the short term, especially authoritarian states can do a brilliant job, and they have historically, in steering these national stories a certain way, especially when they overlay that ideological propaganda with things like, this is for national survival or national power, right? National status. Incredibly effective, and we see that in many of the most resilient authoritarian regimes. Whether those kinds of efforts can hold long term, I think, is much more debatable. I think they can be sustained as long as sort of economic development follows. But once sort of the provision of a good life starts to falter, again, citizens are smart, and they learn from these experiences about the intent of the state.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question here and here. We'll go up and then. And we have one here.
Thank you. My name is Y.M. Hong. I work at a bank in the research department. Thank you very much for your presentation. So first, just one quick anecdote, which probably exemplifies that military experience. I did go to the Mid Korean military, and there is a typical joke that goes around that Korean guys have been to the military, and if they have a girlfriend, there are three things that the girlfriend hate the most. The first is talking about the military. Second thing is talking about soccer. The thing they hate the most is guys talking about playing soccer in the military. So it's a very shared type of thing. So just one anecdote, which you may use in the future. So my question actually is a little bit unrelated to that. It's I find very interesting your discussion around ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism, because one thing which, as a non-political scientist, which always confounded me was the term in Korean, nationalism. Typically we say 민족주의,
Right.
which I think is much closer to the ethnic nationalism. And then when you talk about the nation state in Korea, you also call it 민족국가, which seems as if it's like a single ethnic nation, which is probably not the sort of the correct definition. But what my thought would be, I mean, if you look at Korea and Taiwan, those are very particular countries in Asia, relatively small contained area, and also they had sort of the post-war, specific enemies. So I'm sort of trying to grapple, how can this concept of you looking at the nationalism be expanded to other parts in Asia? Because if you think about most other major Asian nations, India is a very good example.
Yeah.
Indonesia, multi-ethnic. So how would you look at those countries? Is there a way to sort of look at that in this framework, given that there are various ethnicities and probably you don't really share that kind of national stories?
That's a fantastic question. And I think it really gets to what distinguishes ethnicity from nation. So for Korea, those two things are very much, as you said, the very terminology of 민족주의 shows you how closely those two things have always been together, right? But in other places, nations might be based more on religious identities rather than ethnic. India is a fantastic example. You have a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation that started out with a very particular vision of nation that was trying to be all-inclusive of those categories that now we're seeing under Modi kind of revert back to, Hindu nationalism. And that's causing issues. The reason it's causing issues is not because it's based on religion, but because it fractures the national community into an us versus them within a singular democracy. So that is to say that, you can build singular nations from multi-ethnic populations. Of course, it might be easier to build a singular nation from a mono-ethnic society, and that's probably why in many of these instances we see mono-ethnic societies gravitate more, at least in the beginning, towards more of this ethnic conception of nationhood, because it's the most natural. But that's not to say that multi-ethnic societies can't come up with singular national identities that are inclusive, or at least inclusive in a way that cuts across those different ethnic boundaries. But it's a hard project in terms of nation building, and I think in some ways we're seeing sort of the repercussions of that in India right now. These things don't come out of thin air. That tension always was there. And India's democracy had done a really impressive job, I think, really trying to unite the country under a singular national model. But as we see, sometimes these things come back to bite. The U.S. is also I think, a great example of this. There were always sort of dueling visions of nationhood in the United States, one which was very much Protestant white ethnic, and the other that was much more embracing of, civic, liberal, however you want to define that. They fought a civil war over it, right? And one side won, but that doesn't mean that the other side went away. It just kind of became taboo. But now as we're seeing real socio-demographic changes in the U.S. as well, we're seeing that kind of underground nationalist vision come back in a very forceful way in contemporary U.S. politics. So, having a singular ethnic community does make it, I think, structurally easier to come up with a singular nationhood, but it doesn't predetermine it. And in fact, there are cases where, countries have come up with very inclusive nationalisms, even in multi-ethnic countries. So I think that's what you're getting at, of how do we expand this to other places that are much more racially diverse, have messier histories in a sense. And there are examples on both sides. So the sort of project of nation building is all the more important and something that needs to be constantly tended to. Yeah.
You had your question?
Yeah. My name is Jackson Lopez. I'm a student at Bard College. And I had a question about agency. Mm-hmm. You spoke earlier about how oftentimes it's very easy and authoritarian regimes are very good mm-hmm. at kind of shaping the national narrative into what they want it to be. And I think populist movements as well do this mm-hmm. to a very effective degree. You mentioned the Alternative for Deutschland. I think that's an excellent mm-hmm. example of this. So I wanted to ask how democratic regimes, and I'm really thinking about Taiwan here, what tools they have at their disposal to, for matters of national security, to try and bridge the divide between the state and the people, while still towing the line of not kind of descending into authoritarianism. I also recognize that in terms of Ukraine, for instance, you can have these very swift changes and national identity. But in that case, it was the response of the incredible trauma of the Russian invasion, both in 2014 and on a larger scale in 2022. So I'm more thinking, how can we, theoretically avoid that and try and make changes through the agency of the government and its political elites?
Your question just touches like directly on something that is kind of implicit in the book, which is that, ever since World War II, right, and the ethnic genocides that occurred during World War II and then followed in sort of the aftermath, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, democracy has always had this weird, strange, very tenuous relationship with nationalism. It was seen as something to be avoided, something that needed to be minimized for democracy to thrive. There's always been this sort of almost like a trade-off relationship. As you said, like dictatorships and authoritarian regimes have very quickly recognized the power of integrating national identity with ideology. Democracies have shied away from it because of those historical experiences. And I think, I hope that one thing the book does for policymakers is to show them, actually, democracies are late to the game. You have to lean into not just more nationalism, but how do we use nationalism in a way that helps democracies, that builds political loyalty to democratic values and principles, right? And one way, I think, one great example of this happening right now, I think, is Taiwan in response to China's growing aggression. So Tsai Ing-wen has very explicitly kind of tried to redirect the direction of the DPP and her party towards steering away from what is now kind of like a generationally old ethnic claim of difference from Chinese into a much more democratic claim. That what defines Taiwan, whether you identify or come from, whether you're like a descendant of the Kuomintang or not, or which region originally you come from the mainland, regardless of all of that what unites us is our commitment to democracy. Now, we can have like a full day conference on whether that's a good strategic move or not. But in terms of really trying to explicitly reframe the identity of the state and what it stands for, right? It was very clear what Taiwanese national identity stood against, but it wasn't really clear what it then stood for, right? And Tsai Ing-wen, I think, is being really smart about looking at the shifting kind of security landscape in the region to say this is an identity that Taiwanese national identity at large can really rally around. Now, how effective, she got kind of a blowback in the midterm elections after she started trying to do this, as you might know. And so how effective are these strategies beyond just the rhetorical? They have to, again, this goes back to the first question of lived experience, right? That it's not just fluff, it's not just rhetoric. People really need to feel then that the state is embracing those values in a consistent manner across all policy domains, right? So then, Taiwan's position on sort of the Hong Kong refugees needs to be very consistent with those values, which it has not been. Especially after the refugees have come into Taiwan, a lot of them have had to leave because there is no long-term permanent residence program for them, right? So it can't just be rhetoric, but I do see Taiwan capitalizing on this window of opportunity to, what democratization failed to do for them, sort of this reformation of the national identity of the state. In some ways, China is helping them, giving them a reason to really do that now. So I think that's something to really watch for in the next couple of years, whether Taiwan is successful in doing that or not.
Well, thank you very, very much. We really appreciate, and I don't know if we got a policy question, but we actually are out of time, unfortunately, if we did, but maybe we can get it to our speaker who can answer if we do have one. I really want to thank all of you for being here today, and especially I'm honored and learned so much from your exploration and the discussion, and just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Darcie.